EIP-721 NFT standard is revolutionary as it opens doors to many application developers. To build an application using EIP-721, standards on NFT extensions are useful. Today, we are going to talk about ERC-721 extension that got merged as final a few days ago. Welcome to PEEPanEIP episode 74. I am Pooja Ranjan, and with me is Daniel Ivanov, the author of EIP-4400 ERC-721 Consumable extension. Welcome to the show, Daniel.
Thank you, Pooja. And I'm glad to be here. Delighted to present the EIP.
Right. Just to provide some more info about this proposal, this EIP-4400 is a standard track ERC proposal drafted in September 2021, is merged as final in May 2022, and is available for application developers to implement in their projects. In this episode, we will learn more about the proposal with Daniel, starting with a brief introduction. So without further ado, let's peep in.
Thanks. Okay, so just an introduction of myself. I've been building in the Web3 space for several years now, and I'm a co-founder of EnterDAO, which is a DAO focused on building metaverse-related protocols, one of which is called Landworks, which is actually the reason why this EIP was introduced in the first place, since that's while we were working on the protocol, we found out that there's some missing pieces to the ERC-721 infrastructure. So the Landworks protocol, it's basically a renting protocol for metaverse land. And as I mentioned, this is actually the main reason why the EIP exists right now. Other than that, I'm a tech lead at several other Web3 projects at LimeChain, which is a Web3 development company. And along with that, I'm a core developer for Hedera Hashgraph. And more specifically, I'm working on the EVM integration within the network. So meaning EVM contracts being able to run on Hedera, that's the focus for the last several months. You can see the focus all over the place is EVM. So I'm excited to onboard them with the EVM integration as well. So without further ado, let's get into the description of the EIP. And actually, prior to that, I would like to state two assumptions that we had in the beginning when we created the EIP. So for the past year or so, we've seen a big explosion of use cases for ERC-721s. And the ones that picked up the most popularity are obviously art and profile picture NFTs. So however, we are expecting at some point that those would not be the only assets that would get tokenized as ERC-721s. And that's an assumption by almost everyone in the community. We already have examples for that with Metaverse Land or game items. Those NFTs have inherent utility built into them. So land can be used to build scenes or experiences on top of it. Game items are used to enhance or a given character with additional stats, or even provide a separate look to that character. One of the assumptions that was taken into account when creating the ERC-4400 standard was that we were seeing more and more NFTs that have utility attached to them rather than being simple profile pictures. And the second assumption is that if a given NFT has utility, it theoretically has value attached to it. As all things, if something has value, you as an owner might want to delegate or pass that value or utility to someone else for usage, but at the same time, keep the ownership to yourself. As a real world example, you can share your car or you can rent out your house to someone else, but you're kept as the owner, and the other user is simply the consumer of the utility of that NFT. Having said that, we can continue with the problem that we have at hand and how the EIP can help with that. So The best case to showcase or validate those assumptions are by looking at the existing metaverse projects. Developers are defining their own custom roles that utilize or capture the utility of a given NFT. A clear example of this is Metaverse Land. And actually, although it's the first example, as I already mentioned, I do not think that it will be the last one. So giving concrete examples, Decentraland has developed the concept of an operator, and an operator is simply another address that is able to deploy scenes or experiences to that land in the metaverse. But it does not have the full ownership permissions attached to it. Another example is CryptoVoxels, now Voxels. They have the concept of collaborators. And guess what? Collaborators are the same as operators, although they have a different name. So they have the same functionality. Collaborators cannot transfer the actual NFT. They can build on top of it, but they simply have a different name. So we all know the benefits of standardization. It enables more people to build on top of each other and ultimately provide better service or experience to end users. Obviously, the perfect example for that would be the ERC-20 standard. And we wouldn't have this rich DeFi ecosystem thriving without standardizing how fungible token behaves, for example. So with the definition of the EIP that I'm going to talk about, the ERC-721 consumable extension, our goal was to be as simple as possible without adding too much overhead for developers to implement it. And as you can see from the interface, there's only one event that is emitted, which is the consumer changed event. And it is emitted when the owner of the token ID, it basically emits the current owner of the token ID, the consumer, the new consumer, and the specific token ID that it refers to. And it's emitted when the consumer is changed. The concept for the interface has a lot in common with the approval concept of ERC-721s, meaning that the token ID can have only one consumer set at a given time, the same way as having only one approved address for a token ID. We can see the other two functions there, the consumer of and change consumer. Consumer of is a super simple standard view function that just returns the consumer at the moment for the given token ID. And change consumer is basically a state transition, state changing function, which updates the consumer of the specified token ID. As usual, I haven't specified it in the example here. And for the listeners, not the people that see the screen, I am presenting right now the interface of the ERC-721 consumable extension with the event and the two functions there. As I mentioned them, the consumer of and change consumer. And this interface extends the ERC-165, which has the supports function, making it easy for other contracts to figure out whether a certain ERC-721 implements the extension or not. So as you can see, the interface is super simple. It doesn't have an additional overhead. And we can actually see the reference implementation. Since we have people that would be listening only, I would go over briefly. Okay, so along with the EIP, there's an example implementation that users can easily extend and not implement the standard themselves. And as it's shown, the consumable extension extends the ERC-721 and has only one additional state mapping that's stored in state, which is a mapping between the token ID and the given consumer of the token specified at a certain moment of time. And there's no changes to the constructor. The same way you create an ERC-721, you create an ERC-721 consumable. What we should point out here is that obviously we have the consumer of view function that simply returns the consumer of a given token ID. We have the function of a change consumer. And something that is worth noting is that not only the owner of the token ID can change the consumer, but actually if the sender is an approved address, he can change the consumer as well. Or if the sender is approved for all token IDs of the specified current owner, he'll be able to change it as well. We have the supports function there as well, which is a standard one, and something that's more subtle, but it's important to specify, is that we are overriding the before token transfer hook provided by OpenZeppelin. So before you transfer something, a normal ERC-721 clears out the approved address for the token, and the same way that the approved address for the token is cleared, the same way we are changing the consumer to the default address when we're transferring the token. And we are doing that because you can actually introduce attack vectors if you're not clearing it out. So this is something to point out to developers when they want to use this standard. Although it is recommended, and it's specified as recommended to clear out the address to the 0 address of the consumer on every transfer, you may decide to set it to some specific address. For example, on every transfer, the default consumer of every token is assigned to some administrative address. That's something that was received as a feedback during the review process. And that's why we've made the EIP, the address not to be a must to be changed to the address 0, but a recommended one. So before we are transferring tokens, we're clearing out the consumer. And when we clear out the consumer, we are obviously emitting the consumer changed event. That's the actual reference implementation. Now I want to show you now how people can actually extend it and include it into their contracts. Yeah, I already covered here. What I'm showing in the slides right now is the code snippet for the before token transfer modification that clears out the consumer on every transfer. We already covered that a couple of minutes ago. So how does it look like to actually use and create such a token? Well, it's super simple. Here you can see a code snippet that imports the ERC-721 consumable Solidity file that I just showed previously. And it simply calls the constructor with the 2 arguments, the name and the symbol. And everything else is handled automatically. You don't have to implement some functions, extend, etc. By default, that's everything that you need to do. And this actually would enable a lot more stuff to be able to be built on top of your ERC. And we're going to cover them right now. So we're going to talk about what exactly can be achieved, or how is it used right now by other people. So obviously we mentioned that we are introducing a new role. That new role is called consumer, just to iterate, and that consumer does not have permissions to transfer the ERC-721, but it has the permissions to utilize the utility, or basically consume the utility of the NFT. And it's very broadly defined, consume the utility, because each, as I mentioned, I would expect that NFTs, each NFT might have a different utility, might be utilized in a different way, but it's important to have a specific address that's defined as the address that should consume that utility without being able to transfer it. So what we're seeing here in the diagram is how the EIP can help you build layers and layers of additional functionalities to your NFTs, and how you can provide more services. So let's say that Alice has a land ERC-721. Somewhere she's having a land in some metaverse. She lists or deposits her land ERC-721 into a renting protocol, renting marketplace. When she does that, the renting marketplace creates an NFT for her position that implements the standard of EIP-4400. This is basically a representation similar to how Uniswap creates NFTs for the positions of users. The land renting marketplace creates an NFT for Alice's position, and that holder of the NFT is eligible to collect rent fees or update the renting conditions, etc. After she receives the NFT, she can actually deposit it. Let's say there's a yield farming campaign for the same marketplace, land renting marketplace. Let's say that the developers of the marketplace want to incentivize people to use the marketplace, so they are using the normal mechanics by providing yield farming campaigns, and you can deposit the EIP-4400 NFT that you got issued into that yield farming campaign. When you deposit it, technically speaking, the ownership is the ownership of the NFT is within the yield farming contract. So you cannot actually collect your fees or manage your listing, etc. So what the EIP provides as a functionality is whenever Alice deposits her NFT, the contract sets her as a consumer. So while the ownership is within the yield farming contract, Alice is set as a consumer of that NFT. And what it basically means is that she can go to the land renting marketplace and manage her listing. She can collect rent, she can update the renting conditions, while at the same time, the contract is deposited and owned, sorry, the NFT that represents her position is deposited and owned by the yield farming contract. So that's one example that we can see, which is live currently and is working. But what else we can see? What else we can do with it? So I've already mentioned that users can delegate the management of their ERC-721 to some other person, or actually to themselves, but provide the ownership to an NFT yield farming contract, for example. That's the first example, NFT yield farming example. Another thing that this enables is basically a trustless and non-collateralized NFT renting. So you can think of it as Uniswap, but for NFT renting. You go into a website, you add your, let's say you have a collection, a given NFT, you provide your NFT for rent to other people, and some other person can rent it out without providing collateral, without giving prior to that some amount of value. Currently, renting is done in a slightly different way. The first iteration of NFT renting was implemented by actually transferring the ownership of the NFT to the renter. And if you think about it, when you rent a car or you rent an apartment, you do not get the ownership of that apartment or a car. You're just renting it for a while. The owner is still the owner. You're not being owner while you're renting it. And that's actually a limitation to the first iteration of NFT renting. Now, when there's a separate role called consumer that doesn't have the ability to transfer, doesn't have the ownership rights, we can build out non-collateralized NFT renting, meaning that you don't have to pay some amount just to get your just to rent an NFT and pay the rent on top of that. You are just paying for the rent and being able to utilize the NFT. And what I mean trustless is, since it's inherent to the ERC-721, you're only trusting the smart contracts and the code. If there's bugs, yeah, that's a problem. But if it's written properly, as we can see, Uniswap can be thought of as a public good almost. It's not controlled by anyone at this point, at least the V2 or the older versions. So that's what it would enable, and what I'm actually excited about. And the last thing is basically we can build out protocols that fractionalize NFTs that actually generate yield. And if so, let's say that you have an NFT that generates yield, such as the land that you deposit to the land renting marketplace. That NFT generates yield. And what you can do with it is actually fractionalize it. And through the consumer extension again, when you fractionalize it, you're going to enable someone else to manage it, or you can manage it yourself, or the person that has the majority of the shares, etc. You have more flexibility. You don't have to vote on everything, or the fractionalization protocol is not required to manage the NFT. There might be someone else that manages the NFT that generates yield. So that's basically the overview and what it enables. If you have any questions or something to reiterate on.
Thank you so much, Daniel, for sharing this presentation and explaining reference implementation and even the code snippet things. I hope this will be helpful for developers trying to implement it in their project. So for people, if you have any question, you can drop it down on the chat and we can probably read it. Otherwise, I have a few questions for you that we have already collected for this particular proposal.
Okay.
So my first question is about the renting usage and multiple proposals. So it's been observed that the EIP repository is getting multiple proposals for the same kind of use case. Here the use case is rent. So following the discussion on FEM, I figured there are a couple of more, and one of them is EIP-2615, that is non-fungible token with mortgage and rental function. The proposal is currently in stagnant status, but I'm wondering, like, how can you differentiate the proposal 4400 with proposal 2615, if you may have looked into that proposal earlier? Yeah.
So when we first started working on the land renting protocol, we've went through whether there's something in place, and it turns out that there wasn't something that's finalized. The 2615 EIP is stagnant for a while. I would say that the differences are the following. So if you see the interface, it introduces a lot of complexity, and the proposed interface is quite big. It has a lot of functions there, and it's not lean design similar to what we have, simple 2 functions and one event. So it takes the approach of introducing a new type of owner. Therefore, it adds a lot more functions, such as adding balances to adding balance functions, etc. Where in the 4400 EIP, we are leaning more towards the approval or delegation side, and it makes it smaller in terms of interface compared to the stagnant one that you're referring to. If you open the interface, you would see that there's 20 new functions. And as a developer, when you see that you have to implement 20 new functions to an already, I don't know, 20 functions of within the ERC-721, you just start, I don't know, questions start to pop up.
Absolutely, I get that part. That is obvious. Like this proposal 4400 is seems way more simpler. Talking about proposal 4987, and people mentioned that it would be nice to promote it along with 4400. So I wonder if you have any comment that if this proposal can be complementary to 4400.
Yeah, I think that 4987 aims to achieve something similar to 4400, but from another perspective. The use case for 4400 is the owner specifying who has the rights to consume the NFT. And as far as I understand, in 4987, you're basically transferring the ERC-20 or ERC-721 or 1155 to be held by another contract or a person, but not, and again, not providing them with the ability to transfer them. Similar to renting them out, but you just send them just to hold it for a while. That's how it sounds to me. I think that theoretically renting could be implemented through the 4987, and I would generally say that I cannot see a straightforward way on how to complement each other. They're just taking different approaches and trying to tackle the issue from different perspectives. And what it is worth noting is that 4987 actually defines not only ERC-721 changes, but ERC-20 and 1155, which is more in terms of scope. So if it turns out that health concept works, it might cover not only NFT renting, but ERC-20 and 1155. So I think that we're just taking different approaches to the problem, and I guess we will have to see what it's easier for developers to adopt.
That's right. I mean, the best part here is proposal 4400 is already a standard. So even if the other proposal does not make it, there we have an alternative route. So at least we have something for developers to implement in their project if they are thinking in this direction.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, thank you. Yeah, I mean, like we recently have started this concept of working group to bring all authors with a similar kind of proposal in a room so they can push one proposal that is the best. And here it is obvious, like proposal 4400 is serving multiple use cases, and it is one of the best proposals which were proposed in the EIP repository. So congratulations for that.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Actually, on the working group, I think that it's a great idea. That's something that I thought while I was working on the EIP. What I saw was that there are multiple people trying to solve the same problem. They are all proposing different stuff. You try to collaborate, but there's quite a friction in some cases. And at the end of the day, what I'm scared of is, let's say that this EIP has been finalized. At some point, some other EIP related to or tackling renting is finalized as well. 1, 2, or 3 years down the line, we might see multiple EIPs trying to provide renting for NFTs, just as an example. And what I fear is looking back and seeing that we have 5 different ways to incorporate renting into NFTs, and each has its own pros and cons, and there's no one coherent way of doing it. Some of the best standards that I think the crypto industry has come up with was the ERC-20 and ERC-721s, and there's no other alternative, so to say. Those the 3: 1155, 721, and ERC-20, and those are the dominant ones, and those were perfectly fit. But for renting or other types of extensions, I think that we might see blurring, and I really hope that we have a good, coherent standard for different types of things. That's something that I think might be a problem, and it's a hard problem to tackle because you as a maybe an EIP maintainer, let's say, you have to keep in mind that there's already something else that's similar to what this person is proposing. So you better go and collaborate with that person. Otherwise, we will end up with multiple not perfect standards for the same functionality.
So if this is of any help, I'm hoping that we do not end up in any such situation, because the group of EIP editors generally tries to make sure that we do not have similar proposal already in final status. And if it is there, they either encourage having an extension of something. Like, for example, we started working on this as an extension to 721. So that's generally the idea. If you're providing more than whatever is existing, then only they are allowed to be merged as final. Otherwise, there should be some major drawback of the earlier proposal that the new proposal is solving. Again, we will try to have a single proposal for people to follow as a standard.
Yeah.
All right, I see a question here in the chat by Soumya. Soumya, do you want to read the question yourself?
I can go ahead. So my question is, if there are multiple utilities that are attached to a particular, say, ERC-721 contract, does it allow the owner and the renter to split these utilities? Or is it only like based on like utility and ownership? Or can I also play around with utilities?
So just to reiterate your question, make sure that I got it right. You're wondering whether if someone specified as a consumer and he obviously is entitled to the utility, is the owner entitled to the utility as well, or he's just owning? Is that your question?
Correct. And can I play around with it? Can I give some amount of utility to the owner and some amount of utility to the consumer?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And that's why we edited the EIP just prior to being finalized, and we changed and added a little bit of wiggle room, so to say, to developers. And I mentioned it previously. The short answer is the EIP does not enforce whether the owner has still rights to the utility. And we didn't want to enforce that because there's a lot of use cases. We might end up in a use case where the owner is normally okay to get the utility, not only the consumer. So it's not enforced within the EIP in any way. It's up to you to decide whether the owner has the utility as well or only the consumer. I will give you an example. If you're working with a metaverse land, you might want to specify someone else to be able to deploy scenes to that, but the metaverse might accept you as an owner to be able to deploy as well. Not only you, but the consumer. So both of you can deploy scenes. But if it's something different, let's say, I don't know, who is eligible to collect rent out of that NFT, might be suitable to go to the consumer, because the owner might not be the one that actually produced the yield. It was produced because of the consumer. So there's different use cases, and there's room for you to interpret them as you wish.
Understood. Thanks.
Thank you. So my next question is about the implementation. I suppose Open Zeppelin, that they have already implemented it, and I'm assuming Landworks, your project, they may have implemented it. By any chance, are you aware of any other project who have implemented or in work in progress? So
we have several implementations that I'm aware of. Obviously, our project was the first one, Landworks. CryptoVoxels are working on a new version of their token, and they have incorporated it as well, which is something very cool because they are a major player in the crypto industry, so to say, or at least the metaverse industry. Referring to Open Zeppelin, they tend to add extensions or include those implementations after they are finalized and there's a significant traction and developers actually want to use it. So to your question, OpenZeppelin does not have implementation yet of the consumable extension, but now that it's finalized, we can actually propose it, create pull requests, etc., and get it merged so that developers can use the golden standard way of implementing extensions and tokens.
That would be nice. I have seen OpenZeppelin have been really helpful with like proposals pushing forward, and they are generally having one or the other implementation for most of the proposals that are into ERC categories.
Yeah.
So that's
actually another project that I just thought of. There's a marketplace for NFTs, which is sort of competitor to OpenSea, called Universe. And by default, they are providing way for users to mint their own collections. By default, they are minting NFTs with the consumer extension. So people can easily rent their collections to other people because they are implementing the standard.
That is good to know. I mean, the idea of having a standard is like it can be used by multiple projects. So this is really good to know that the implementation are being accepted by most of the projects in especially NFT and metaverse space.
Yeah.
So talking about implementation, is there any special security consideration that you would like to mention for the implementers to keep in mind?
Yeah, well, we've added it into the security section as well, and I'm going to repeat it again here. It is very important not to break the main assumption of the consumable role, consumer extension, which is basically the consumer should not have permissions to transfer it or specify other people being able to transfer it. So it should stay as simply a consumer. That's the first reason why it actually exists as an extension. And the second thing is, if you want to edit the address that you are going to set on every transfer as a consumer. So when the NFT is transferred, the consumer is cleared. As I mentioned, if you want to specify another address, you have to be very careful what address would be, because it's recommended for it to be the default 0 address. But if you have an administrative address that you want to set every time as a default, you have to be very careful what to place there. But that's less of an issue, I guess. It's a more of an edge case if you want to go into the corner cases of implementing the EIP.
So thank you for sharing. I know it must have been mentioned in the proposal itself, but mentioning it again, I'm sure it's going to help. My next set of questions is about the standardization process. I feel like this proposal 4400, it made it to a final status in fairly decent time, because I have came across proposals which are here for over 2-3 years, and they are still into some different status other than final. So I hope your experience can be learned by other authors. I'm eager to know your thoughts on the current EIP process.
Yeah, well, I briefly mentioned it previously. My concern is just paying attention to what gets approved. And I've noticed that EIP reviewers are actually pointing out this is similar to that, collaborate with that person, etc., etc. So I've already mentioned that. Other than that, I think that when I first created the EIP, maybe there were less EIP reviewers compared to now, and it was a more slow process. It took more time to get the PR changes reviewed, etc. But recently, I've noticed that there's a drastic change in how fast people review PRs for EIP. So actually, that was a quite I would say that was the main reason why it got to this state that fast. I mean, the process was just improved, which, I mean, congrats on that.
I'm happy to know that. Yes, that is true. For some time, we we were like having very few reviewers, and recently we have started engaging more community members to come and review the proposals, even not as an EIP editor. They can be reviewing it as an external reviewer, just give feedback. We are inviting projects to let know author if there are any changes that may help their project, kind of stuff. So definitely we are trying to engage more people there to get these proposals move faster. There is one other thing that has came across with more of the ERC category proposals, especially. Do you, from like an EIP author's point of view, see any need for change in the standardization process? Like people always complain about ERC versus core. I would love to hear your thought.
I think that it's impressive how good the process is. And what I mean by that is it's a really hard problem to solve properly, in my opinion. I think that the last couple of months were very good in terms of organizational wise, etc. I think that there's additional initiatives that are basically bringing more EIP reviewers, which is great. So I think generally I have positive experience with the whole EIP submission, etc.
That's good to know. I'm sure other ERC category authors are also listening to this, and I hope they find the process as equal as core EIP process. One last question on this topic. Is there any specific challenge that you may have faced during the documentation of a standard?
Actually, I would say that if you are trying to write an EIP, make sure to read the first EIP, because everything's written there. And the challenges were actually going through everything in the first EIP. Once I went through everything through the first EIP, I was aware of there were clear steps of what should I do. I didn't have to DM someone explicitly or talk with someone just to get explanation. It was everything was there. Just you have to go to the first EIP and I think that you'll be okay. As I mentioned, the statuses, when you create a PR, they're very explicit. They say what exactly went wrong, what you should do, whether you're waiting review of someone else or you just messed up and you don't have your PR ready yet. So I think that the whole process is very explicit. That's a good thing.
It's always good to hear good words about the current process, because we have been hearing more complaints than appreciation. So I really appreciate you sharing so much of good words for us. Well, thank you. All right, so that ends the list of questions that I have. Anyone on the call today, if you have any question? Well, if not, then we can probably wrap up. Anything else that you would like to share with our viewers related to proposal 4400 or in general?
I would only say that if you want to push for an EIP, just make sure that it's super explicit. It's not big, it's lean, and it's focused. And this will improve your chances of getting it merged. That's the only thing.
I can hear one of the EIP authors saying the same thing. So the idea here is, as Daniel mentioned, that if you are proposing a proposal, make sure it is not trying to solve multiple issues at one time. Try to solve one issue, make smaller proposal. There are high chances of getting it passed. And that's good in a way that if we are stuck with one out of the three problems that a proposal started to solve, we don't have to wait till the third problem is solved. At least people can be making good use of the first two problems that you already have solved.
Yeah.
But that's quite a piece of advice. Thank you so much. Well, I hope information shared today is helpful for NFT app developers, and we see more good projects on NFT in near future. Thank you, Daniel, for taking out time and talking about EIP 4400. And on this note, On this note, thanks to all our YouTube viewers for watching. I hope you have got answers to many of your questions. Check out the description section for link to the presentation and other useful resources. You can also find link to guest Twitter to follow. And another special announcement, in the spirit of the merge upgrade, we have started Know Your Client series on PEEPanEIP. We have shared the first recording on client Besu, and there are more merge special talks coming up your way. So stay tuned, keep watching, keep sharing your love with Ethereum cat holders. Have a good one, everyone.
Thank
Thank
you.
you so much.